We'd already made some reference to what goes on with the ovary during the normal reproductive cycle, how it begins at the beginning of the reproductive cycle. Within the first 14 days, we saw enlargement of the follicle, and at about day 14, we have rupturing of the follicle, or what we call ovulation, the release of the egg from the ovary. And then in days following that, we had the corpus luteum, that scar tissue of the follicle that remains on the ovary, that eventually regresses during development, during that period. The uterine lining also undergoes changes during that time. The uterine lining thickens during the first parts of the reproductive cycle, so it's what we call the proliferative phase of the uterus. And then generally about after day 14, changes that occur within the uterine wall are not to increase its thickness overall, but increase the number of glands and blood vessels that are present in the uterine lining, in the endometrium. We refer to that as the secretory phase. So we have a proliferative phase followed by a secretory phase of endometrial development, controlled by the hormones that are being released from the ovary. In this picture, we have a little sketch of what's going on in terms of the tissues of the endometrium of the uterus. This entire thickness from here down to here would represent the endometrial tissues, endometrium. Below that would be the myometrium, the smooth muscle layer of the uterus. This endometrium has on its surface a layer of simple columnar cells, a simple columnar epithelium, and that simple columnar epithelium folds into the endometrium to make these narrow glands that extend down. So this is an endometrial gland. And it also is made of the same kind of columnar cells as you find forming the lining of the endometrial cavity. Underneath of that, you have this highly cellular connective tissue. Highly cellular connective tissue, and within that you have blood vessels. Those are the primary components of your endometrium. Now, the very surface layers of the endometrium are grown and then sloughed off at menstruation again. And then they regrow and are sloughed off again. They come and go. The deeper layer of the endometrium is more stable and remains from cycle to cycle. This outer zone here that grows and then is lost again is called stratum functionale. The deeper zone here that is stable and from which the endometrium regrows after every cycle is the stratum basale. Same name we had with skin cells at the base of your epidermis in there. So stratum functionale grows and then is lost at menstruation and then regrows and is lost again. Stratum basale stays here and is the foundation from which we regrow that endometrial layer called stratum functionale. As we go from the beginning of the regrowth period to the end, we first have, like we mentioned before, a stage of thickening and development called the proliferative phase. And then after we get a good thickness of cells here, we have an enhancement of all the glandular and vascular components that we call the secretory phase of the uterus. That would be following about the time of ovulation, after ovulation. Okay, I've tried to reconstruct here a diagram that's very common in textbooks to represent the events of the female reproductive cycle showing hormones, the ovarian stages, and what happens in the uterus at the same time. We just got finished talking about the uterine development, so this represents the uterine lining right across here. Day 1, day 14, day 28, out past here. So usually day 1 is the beginning of menstruation. So this is right here. Menstruation in this period right here. Then we begin the next period through here, where we see that thickening, the restoration of the endometrial lining right here. And this we call the proliferative phase of the uterus up to here. And then here we see the enhancement of the glands and blood vessels within the uterus here in this last phase, and we call that the secretory phase of the uterus, right there. Up here at the top, we show what's going on with the ovarian follicle. So this was a primordial follicle. This is a primary follicle. Here's a secondary follicle. This is the mature or Graafian. I'll put a G there to represent the Graafian follicle. And this little arrow and that egg cell there represents ovulation. That's when the egg cell is released from the ovary. Following ovulation, the follicle remains there as corpus luteum. The early corpus luteum is larger and it gets smaller over time. Now the hormones, the lines that I have across here represent pituitary hormones. There are two pituitary hormones we're dealing with. The first one is follicle stimulating hormone. I'll indicate with FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So this shows a slight increase early on and stimulates the beginning of follicle development in the ovary. So these cells up here are responding to that follicle stimulating hormone. There's another hormone called luteinizing hormone that peaks at the same time here at about day 14 as this little bump in follicle stimulating hormone. So that's luteinizing hormone, LH, right there. This increase in those hormones causes sudden growth and proliferation of the antral fluid, which causes rupture of the egg from that enlarged Graafian follicle, that blister-like spot on the ovary. So anyway, that's where that occurs. Following that, we see a gradual decline of both follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. The effects of these hormones on these tissues of the ovary, primarily the follicle cells and those theca interna cells, result in other hormones that affect the uterine development. So the green line, seen right here, represents estrogens. Estrogens being produced by this growing follicle up here. And then the purple line down here represents progesterone. Which is produced primarily by corpus luteum, so you see a large peak in that after ovulation, right there. So the development of the uterine lining during the proliferative phase is primarily under the influence of estrogen, and then after ovulation, the estrogen falls fairly significantly, and you see a peak in the progesterone levels in there. And the progesterone maintains that endometrial lining, that secretory phase, until the progesterone declines. Progesterone being produced by corpus luteum. As the corpus luteum starts to decline, progesterone drops off, and as progesterone drops off, we no longer can maintain that secretory phase of the uterine lining, and it results in menstruation. The loss of that stratum functionale zone of the endometrium, so those tissues are lost, and the bleeding and tissue loss occurs during that period. And then you start up follicle stimulating hormone again and start to produce some more estrogens, and we start to get the development then of the endometrial lining for the next proliferative phase, and then secretory, and round you go. So it's important to know which tissues are producing the follicle-stimulating hormone, pituitary gland, luteinizing hormone, also pituitary gland. We'll go over that here in a bit. It's important to know that these follicles produce estrogens that result in the proliferative phase, and then after ovulation, the corpus luteum is producing more progesterone that allows for the secretory phase, and it's the lack of progesterone at the end of the cycle here as these tissues decline. The corpus luteum goes away, that results in the loss of that endometrial lining. Okay, in this diagram here, we're looking at the hormonal regulation, starting with the hypothalamus. The floor of the brain here produces a hormone we've already talked about with the male reproductive system, gonadotropic release hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland. So that's released into the blood, the gonadotropic release hormone, and it goes directly to the tissues of the pituitary gland. The pituitary, in response, produces follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. FSH here for follicle-stimulating hormone, LH for luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the development of early follicles. So we start to see that follicle growth in the ovary under the influence of FSH. Part of the result of that growing follicle, those follicle cells increasing in number, they're producing plenty of estrogens. And the effect of that is on the uterus. Remember, that causes the thickening of the uterus, what we call proliferative phase of the uterus is influenced mainly by estrogens. Luteinizing hormone also causes enhances the follicular development and causes rupture of the follicle. It also stimulates the corpus luteum here, and it helps it produce progesterone. Progesterone has the effect of increasing the glands and vascular supply in the uterus. We call that the secretory phase. Of the uterus there. Corpus luteum here in the ovary also produces inhibin that feeds back to the pituitary gland to inhibit the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. That is not the only inhibiting route. I made it with a dotted line to indicate inhibition. Estrogens also can have an inhibitory effect, and they will feed back on follicle-stimulating hormone, on GnRH, gonadotropic release hormone, and on luteinizing hormone. So it has an inhibitory effect all around from those upper hormones from the brain and pituitary. Progesterones also have an inhibitory effect, so that progesterones have an inhibitory effect on luteinizing hormone and on GnRH up there. So all these hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin in here, can tell the hypothalamus and the pituitary that we have adequate levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone being produced. And so it reduces the secretions from the hypothalamus and pituitary.